Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to Mark Hewitt. Mark, good to see you.
Likewise, fella.
So, traditional first question. What do you do?
Oh goodness. Before we kick off, just want to say thank you very much for having us over. It's
It's a pleasure,
this
mate.
podcast
I've been trying to get you on here for ages.
No, I know. I apologise for being a little bit evasive. But no, just that I've listened to the podcast for a long time and always enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for that. It's very kind.
To answer the question, I was hoping you might be able to tell me because I don't quite know how to introduce myself in terms of some of the esteemed people that you've had on the podcast before.
Oh,
So
don't worry about that.
I think the only fair thing to say would be I'm an enthusiastic amateur of a lot of things.
Yes.
I
Okay.
think that's probably the easiest way to approach it.
So, because you do, I was going to say, you do a lot of stuff, don't you? I mean, you seem to be busy doing things.
Yeah, I think everyone does though. I think there's an awful lot of people out there who will they might specialize in one thing and talk about that. But I'm sure there's people who've got fingers in multiple pies when they're going through their daily lives.
Now, the first thing is you've got lots of skateboards behind you. So we might as well kick off with that because that is obviously one of your passions.
Yeah, so I've been playing on a wooden toy since 1997, 98. Um, I had a friend from school. He was a bit older than me, and I remember seeing him roll down the street and pop up a curb. He rolled up a curb, and it just blew my mind. I just couldn't believe that you could do that. But prior to that, I was actually given an old board by my grandparents' neighbours, and it turned out to be quite a famous board. It was a pro model for a guy called Mark Gonzalez, and I dutifully took all the graphics off because I thought the graphics were naff, and skated around on that for ages. But yeah, that was my introduction to skateboarding, and I've always really liked the late 80s, early 90s period of skateboarding. I found a lot of inspiration from the older generation, not necessarily older generation, but
I know nothing about skateboarding,
Oh,
so
right.
you have to tell me about this because I didn't even realise there was a different style or whatever.
Oh, yeah. So you've got in very basic terms, you have the 70s boom where people are going around on like the much smaller, narrower boards. And then from the late 70s to early 80s, you get people riding on much bigger boards because they're approaching pool skating in a different way. And then in the early 80s, it was pretty much dead. And out of that came the big 80s skateboard boom of the mid to late 80s, where you've got a lot of vert skating.
Sorry,
Um,
got a lot of
Vert
what?
skating. So you look at the big ramps with the
Oh,
vertical
right.
section, like
Yeah.
half pipes. So that you get that come out of there, and you've got the beginnings of street skating. The street skating was always kind of there, but you get the tricks that they were doing on vert ramps applied to street at that point in time, and then street skating takes off massively. It's a little bit more accessible because you don't have to go to a designated half pipe or ramp spot. You can do it anywhere, and you get so much creativity coming out of both disciplines. And these days, I mean, so there used to be like you were either a ramp skater or you're a street skater. And these days, there doesn't seem to be any divide at all. Like you've got kids who can do stuff on both, and they're very good at it. And it's a great time in skateboarding at the moment. It's always been a great time to skateboarding, but at the moment, it's a incredible time to see how far things are being pushed.
So looking at it from the outside, me looking at it, it seems that it sort of goes in and out of fashion. Now that might just be
Yeah.
me. Um, and there are times when it locks into a musical trend as well.
Yes. Yeah.
So and I know you're interested in music. Um, Tell me a little bit about that, because I don't know the dynamic of how that locks into music. I just know that it sort of does. So,
Well,
what's the early days? Is it
so I mean, you've got punk. Punk's a huge influence on skateboarding, especially in the early '80s when it was dead. Because you've got the whole DIY punk scene coming out of the punk explosion. As punk starts to kind of die a little bit, and especially in America, you've got the hardcore punk movement going off. You get bands like Minor Threat and Black Flag, and they are pictured with skateboards. They participate in skateboarding. So there's a really famous cover of the Minor Threat album cover where they're all on the the stairs of their house, and you've got Ian McKay right next to his board and whatnot. And so you've always had that kind of punk DIY undercurrent to skateboarding.
hmm,
Um, you yeah, I mean, music's a goodness. From a personal perspective, I probably have heard more new music. I've been introduced to more new bands through skateboarding videos than going to clubs or going to gigs. It's always been that was the
that's
way.
interesting?
Yeah.
That is interesting, isn't it? And again, because there's a point here which I think, um, from what I've seen, obviously there's a fashionable thing about guitar
Mm,
that goes in and out of fashion, and at the moment it's sort of out of fashion. I mean, it will come back into
mm,
fashion, but when you sort of get periods of time where everybody wants to own a guitar, and sometimes that is driven by something external, and, and skateboarding is definitely one of them,
mm.
where you start getting that type of thing come in, and you see a sudden uh, uh, interest in playing guitar as well. But at the moment, it's a little bit the guitar's sort of a little bit out of fashion with the young kids. Um, there's a lot of kids interested in doing sort of DJing, sort of drum and
Mm.
bass, you know, doing their own sort of drum and bass sort of stuff. But because I've seen it happen so often, I know it's going to come back into fashion at some point. And I guess that's the same sort of thing with skateboarding.
Oh yeah,
Sort of,
goodness. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like I mentioned before, you had the period where it died off in the early '80s. When I started skating around 97, 98, that was just before the very famous Tony Hawk skateboarding game came out.
yeah,
So that would have been 99-ish. Because I remember being at a competition in Northampton. It was the big Radlands competition. Radlands was a big indoor park in Northampton, and it attracted this one particular competition attracted pretty much everybody who was anybody in a US and European skateboarding, to a horrible, dismal warehouse in the middle of Northampton, and
amazing.
they actually had the game as a demo there, and I remember playing this thinking like this is going to change everything, and it
Yeah,
did, and it brought so many people into it, but then it died off, say 2004, 2005-ish. But then it comes back, and it's good. It's good to have these fallow periods because um, that's when the kind of creativity starts ramping up again.
yeah,
That's what I've noticed anyway,
yeah.
and
I
I'm
think that's
hoping
true.
the
And
guitars as well.
maybe there's something in that that sort of creative surge when it's sort of not so popular. Maybe that's the thing that starts to reignite it when people start to see those things,
Mm,
because it only takes something in a film or or an advert or something like that, doesn't it? Or as you say, like a computer game, because guitars go through a similar thing with like the Guitar Hero
yeah, goodness, yeah.
thing.
So I
Very
imagine
similar thing.
so many people that came to you after playing Guitar Hero. I can
Yeah,
imagine that was a big thing.
yeah, it was. It was massive. Um, and the songs that were on Guitar Hero,
Mm.
as long as the kids could play some of the riffs out there, they were happy as Larry. So
Well, I know
there's
that
sort of
feeling because the only thing I can play on my bass are the things that I want to learn. So
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah, 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 yeah. It's good. So okay, so we got so the skateboarding thing. This is interesting because, as I say, I don't know anything about it at all. Um, But as I say, the artwork and stuff is amazing, isn't it? So it's to me,
Yeah.
my equivalent would be surfboard, surfing,
Oh goodness, yeah, yeah.
surfboards, um, but
Well,
because they look
yeah,
pretty stunning.
it's. I mean, a lot, especially now. It's always been a case that a lot of skateboarders will have an input in their graphics as well, or design them from the ground up, or have that idea and then it'll go off and they'll work on it. I mean, skateboarding is just full of so many creative people. I mean, there's a couple on the book. So this one is by the graphics by a guy called is that a Foz one? I can't remember if that is Foz or not. Oh, that's bad. We'll have to edit that one out actually.
Don't worry.
No,
It's
no,
when people ask me things about guitars, and it's just like, I just play them.
I can't remember if that's Foz or French. I think that's a French, so it's a French board. So there's an artist called French who does a lot of graphics for Heroin. It's a British board, or was a British board. They're based in the US now. Um, but yeah, I mean, goodness, there's so much creativity in skateboarding in terms of graphic design, music, fashion. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a real incredible field.
yeah,
Full of very interesting people, put it that way.
yes, yes. I thought that might be, but so so obviously you got a big interest in music, haven't you? So I know you sort of go off and um, see bands and all the rest of it, and some of them I've never heard of, which is not uncommon, to be honest. Because although I, technically should be keeping my ear to the ground for everything, I get lost.
Well, it's difficult because there's so much good new and old music. I mean,
Oh yeah,
goodness, still discovering old music that I've never heard. Yeah, it's there's so much out there, and especially with the rise of the internet
yeah,
and the just ubiquity of new music, it's hard to to coherently kind of collate new to music. I always feel like you've got to kind of listen to it in context with other things to properly get a
you
feel for
do,
it.
you do. And I think the other thing about the internet is it's also managed um, to bring back into awareness of bands that were around in the past
Mm.
that sort of almost went unnoticed. They had a bit of a following and whatever, and maybe now, I mean, some bands have got probably more interest than they did when they were around the first time.
Well, we're all
Interesting.
hoping for the second wind of Riviera. I mean, we're
Yes.
all about to come.
Yeah, no, well, actually, it's quite interesting because you were saying about Bravura. Um, I didn't realize, I mean, back in the day, we had a big following. We had a lot of airplay. But I just think that you're not really aware of how much people liked you because there's always that, how can you put it? There's a little bit of sort of an imposter syndrome, really, because you're just doing your thing, and you just think, well, you know, it's all right. People seem to like what it is, but when people start saying, because I've got this little project with a guy that we're going to sort of resurrect some material and do a couple of charity gigs, some from his band at that period. So we're talking about the um, sort of early to mid '80s, and the amount of people that contacted me and said, "Oh, that's brilliant," really used to like going to see the band. It's like, and they can remember more about the gigs than I can. I saw you at so and so. It's like, oh, and they could tell me who the support band was and everything, and I can't remember.
Well, that's yeah. It's always interesting to hear versions of events that you've both been to, or
Oh yeah,
people have been to, and then to kind of get the stories and work out what the order of things was, because everyone's approaching it from a different perspective. Everyone's in a different headspace when they enter that particular place. And yeah, I'm not surprised you're getting stories like that because I think a lot of the time, people don't realize what they had or what they were experiencing until that is gone, and they're never going to experience that again. So when people hear that something like that is happening, it's like a reunion for a place, like reunion for a band or a reunion for a certain group of friends. It makes people appreciate these the peculiarity and the special and the uniqueness of that particular moment. And if you can not necessarily relive that, but to experience it in a new way with more appreciation and more gratitude, then yeah, I'm not surprised people are getting excited about it.
Yeah, there's a book by a guy called Jacques Attali, who was a French economist, but he was also a musician, jazz musician, um, called Noise.
mm,
And I've mentioned this book a couple of times on the podcast, but I mentioned it in the book actually. Um, and he sort of he sort of charted the rise of the CD and the decline of the CD before it really happened. So he knew, because of technology, you were going to get this sort of moment where people it was going to be cheap to produce, and you'll get that sort of sweet spot where certain bands will make a lot of money because of the production costs being so low. And then when people realized that the technology was there, that they could produce their own music, the whole thing would collapse financially,
mm.
which has been absolutely true. Because nowadays, because as you said, there are so many new bands, right?
Yeah,
Um,
doing really, really interesting stuff as well.
yes, exactly. But of course, the thing is that now you have to approach it in a slightly different way, that you're not going to do that to make a load of money.
Mm,
I mean, if you make money, then great.
mm.
But that's not really the attitude that you need to have to do that. And I'm guessing that's true of most art forms, really,
Well, this is
or even lots of sport.
mm. Well, again, that's a really good to segue back into skateboarding. I mean, I've
Exactly.
about skateboarding as a sport. It's it's unstructured fun,
Yeah.
and it is also an up. If you look at certain skateboarders, the way that they move, the style in which, I mean, you can extend that to guitarists as well. I know
Yeah.
you're very, very intrigued by the way that oh goodness, Jimi Hendrix, the way that you say that he wasn't the best guitar player in the world. It was the way that he played guitar, and it's like I could say John Cardiel isn't the best skateboarder in the world, but it's the way that he used to skate.
Yeah.
Um, I would rather. I mean, this is the thing with skateboarding now, because it's in the Olympics, and the the Olympics needs skateboarding more than skateboarding needs the Olympics. It,
Yes.
it's
Yes.
it's presenting it in a way that it's kind of trying. I don't know if it's going to, but the way that you kind of judge something is by codifying a certain standard. So this is the way a certain grind should look. This is the way you should land a certain thing. Personally, I'd rather see someone go super fast, hang on by the skin of their teeth, and ride out sketchily out something that they were never ever look like they were never going to make, rather than see someone perform something and then land perfectly with like gymnast arms. And there's a certain type of attitude, and likewise, I'd rather see someone play with passion and again by the skin of their teeth, rather than see someone just technically be a wizard on something and not put a foot wide. There's a rawness to art. There's a rawness in the way it is expressed and the way it manifests. And I'm not trying to say it is a judgment call. Obviously, I've got an aesthetic preference for somebody going balls out on something. It's just I vibe off that particular um, expression of it more so than I would a virtuoso classical performance. But you can get that too. It's the thing. You can go to a classical concert and you can still see that rawness come through. Or the
You
way that
can, but it's not. This is interesting because what you've hit on there, I could just say that is absolutely perfectly applicable to guitar and where guitar playing is now, because it's in just about any college or university that you'd like to, there's so many courses out there,
mm,
people want to pay money to do that. Now, I don't know how long that's going to be because again, this stuff is pretty cyclic, I think. Um, but what we're ending up with is something completely different from what made contemporary guitar work
Mm.
in the first place. Not because people knew the solos by so and so, because you could never work them out properly. So you always ended up having to make a few guesses. And it's funny actually because I've just watched a video with Rick Beato and George Benson. And George Benson is one of the greatest guitar players ever. I mean, incredible. But Benson actually said, he couldn't work out what Wes Montgomery was doing half the time. So he said, and so he didn't copy him. He would copy the effect that he had and nick a few of his ideas, but he wouldn't try to copy his licks, which is what we're doing now. But then, of course, what you end up with is somebody's style that's totally unique. And again, saying about that skate, you'd rather see a skateboarder that takes a risk and it's almost like he's not going to make it type of thing. Well, I would just say to that, Jimmy Page, because Jimmy Page was like that. Page would play a solo, and it's almost like he's sort of like hanging it in there by the skin of his teeth. And he would deliberately leave mistakes in a recording because the performance was good.
That's interesting. Only because are you aware of the documentary? Is it Mr. Jimmy? Have you heard of?
I haven't seen that. No.
I've not seen it, but I'm itching to watch it, and
Oh.
I'm interested to see if that guy kind of leaves in the mistakes that because he was this is the Japanese guy who's basically modeled his entire playing style on Jimmy Page.
Oh, right.
Yeah, oh God, I think you'd really love. So I'll send you the link after this.
Oh, right. Okay, that's cool.
Because what he does, he copies the performances, but it goes beyond copying. It's like it's almost like I don't want to say religious experience for him, but it's beyond just a
yeah. It's almost like NLP modeling, right?
Possibly, yeah.
He's becoming Jimmy Page.
Yes, yeah, very much so. It's more than a tribute. It's definitely more than a tribute. He lives it, and I'd be interested to know if he leaves in the same mistakes as Jimmy Page did. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Documentary, but that's really intriguing.
There's a song. There's a documentary called oh God, what's it called? Oh gosh, it'll come to me in a minute. But it's a meeting of Jimmy Page, Jack White, and The Edge of U2 in a sort of warehousey sort of place with loads of guitars, and they just talk about guitar playing. And obviously, Jack White and The Edge you can see they're absolutely in awe of Page. But it's a brilliant documentary. Page really sort of talks about his influences. They all talk about their influences, right? And you can actually see that Page really likes, particularly Jack White's playing, because it's got this sort of raw blues thing going. Although, he sort of reworked it that it comes out as the White Stripes sort of stuff, but it's primarily sort of old blues, But you get the sort of feel that what was going on with Page is that he'd done so much session work, which he absolutely hated by the end of it, because he was recording loads of music, lift music in the end. Being paid a lot of money for doing it. So he just didn't want to have this thing where everything was perfect. Like the timing being like rigid. So one of his things was, can we get it so that the timing could sort of flex like the old blues players would do.
Mm.
And you can sort of hear that in the way that Zeppelin play, that it's got that sort of slightly ragged feel about it. So this goes back again to what you're saying about watching somebody who lays it all on the line, and takes a risk. And that was something that was said about Hendrix. I interviewed John Etheridge, who knew Jimmy, used to go and see Jimmy play a lot. And he said you'd get, something would go wrong. The amp would blow up, or you'd bust a string, whatever, or the PA would break, or whatever. He said, but you'd get about half an hour, 40 minutes of just total amazement. He said, because he pushed it to the limit. It absolutely pushed it to the limit. And, you don't see an awful lot of that, I don't think. And maybe you're less likely to, that as soon as when, bands, they start making money and they've got an agency, an agent behind them, and everything's got to be on point because there's so much money riding it. They don't take risks.
I mean, that's something I can't comment to, because obviously I've never been in that position in terms of having to contractually fulfill an obligation from that perspective. But from a romantic kind of point of view, I can kind of see why that would be a massively curtailing element.
Oh God, absolutely.
Those imperfections that actually make the thing perfect and unique. You need that grit for the mill. You need
do.
the millstone. It's the grist to the mill, rather. Is the expression I was looking for. You need that to make it into the thing that stands out from everything else.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. I mean, I used to sort of rehearse a band to the point where there was enough that could go wrong that would make it exciting. There'd be elements in a song that you could take it somewhere else. So everybody was playing and listening, because it wouldn't necessarily do what they would expect that time round.
And again, you're playing with the liminality of senses there as well. That's it's anxiety inducing, but also creatively quite exciting.
Yeah, but the thing is, you didn't want to have the same show as you did the last time. Otherwise, what are you doing it for? That was always my attitude. What are we doing it for if it's just going to be monotonous? There's no point. But as I say, when there's money involved, it becomes difficult and tricky.
Yeah, I can imagine.
To do that. So you've got lots of other interests now, so we've just focused on one. That was pretty amazing, because, as I say, I knew.
I really enjoy hearing about, because the music and skateboarding, they're parallel things. Your creativity in terms of the way that they're structured. I probably could wax lyrical about that all night. So, but yeah, I was really interested to hear what you were saying about that, because it vibes completely with how I feel. So it's just kind of nice to get a bit of validation with that.
Yeah. Well, this is what I find interesting with talking to people who are interested in things other than what I do, because I listen to stuff and go, "Oh my goodness, there's a vibe that's the same as this." That tells me something about the nature of how we perceive things. Whether that's skateboarding, or it's music, or it's it's playing an instrument, or it's being interested in places and stuff. Because here's a point. I'll just sort of pluck something out of thin air. I would say, because if you're interested in stuff that's not mainstream, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit sort of on the edge, which is definitely true with me. I'll tell you a little story in a minute about the fact that, I'm not a person who sort of dwells in the center of anything, to be honest. And likewise, if you're a skateboarder, you're not really dwelling in the center of anything. You're sort of slightly on the margins of what's going on, I would guess.
Yeah, to a degree, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, your other interests might be very similar like that.
Mm.
They might be sort of on the edge of stuff.
If it's on the edge, it's probably sitting on a sofa that's near the edge.
Yeah, yeah, but you see what I'm getting at. It's not mainstream.
Yes, yeah,
So there's a point there that you sort of go, well, that's strange. That's strange that that should be the case. That should respond. You've got something that you've got a passion for, but the very essence of what it is that you've got the passion for is very similar to how that place, other interests that you have could be placed.
it's a nice foil. It is, and because I don't have many other physical outlets in terms of sport, I've never been particularly sporty. I mean, bless them, my grandfather and my dad tried so hard to get me into golf and cars, and I had no interest in either of them. So skateboarding fulfills that role for me, and it's a very good foil to the other things that I'm interested in terms of the things that you're hinting at, in terms of a culture and a magical work
Hmm.
and everything that surrounds that.
Yeah. So now this is interesting. So I was out walking the other day, and I'm quite, obviously when I walk, I spend a lot of time just pondering things. Um, and I've personally been aware for quite some time that I'm somebody who, although I find it easy sort of making friends and everything, I'm never in the center of anything. I'm always somebody that is on the edge of whatever group I'm involved in. So I became aware quite early that I would have one group of friends and another group of friends, and never the twain should meet, if you see what I mean. So you couldn't mix those friends together, which was interesting. Um, and then I realised that actually I was born into a situation like that. So my parents had been married before. They both had families. My mother's first husband died. And my dad left his first wife. So I had loads and loads of brothers and sisters, but they were half brothers and sisters. And I was a solitary soul in this particular marriage. But I saw my other brothers and sisters, and I got on really well with them, right? So that is exactly the same situation as I had for friends. But then I noticed that that was exactly the same situation wherever it was, if I had a job or whatever, or like what I do with guitar teaching, I go into a school, go and do a bit of teaching and clear off. I wouldn't sort of hang around in the staff room. Although it wasn't that I didn't get on with people, I could sort of chat to them, they knew who I was, but I would never sort of get involved in the politics of a school or anything. I wouldn't even go to the functions or anything like that because it just didn't interest me.
Mm.
And I thought, well, that's really strange that attitude, which is a bit like I was saying, maybe your interest in other things will be very similar to the way that you've got an interest in skateboarding, and you see what I mean. That sort of slightly on the edge stuff, the music that's related to that and all the rest of it. And it sort of, there was something that occurred to me, there's facets of that still show up in my life that I'd not noticed until now. Because once you start to see that, you start to see it everywhere in yourself, right? And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I think there's something that, see, what I'm getting at is there's something deep down in us that is like the essential nature of what we are, whatever that is, that shows itself in those type of things. And so let's have a, you've got some interesting things. You've done a book and stuff like that. So let's talk about what you've just done with the book.
Oh goodness, the Snowshill book. Yeah, okay.
Because I think this is a good example
Right.
of this very thing that I'm getting at.
So just before we do, just to counterpoint, because I had a really interesting thought which was pertinent to what you were saying. I think that might have been your experience, say when you were in and out of the schools teaching, say 20 years ago. I don't know if that's the same experience you have now.
Oh, yeah.
With the rise of social media. I mean, unless you're curating your, I don't curate any kind of social media. I'm not trying to sell a personality or anything. Like I'm quite open with the things that I do, not to the sense that I'm talking about like my magical practice, because that is fairly subjective. That's for me. But in terms of skateboarding, writing, painting, I'm quite open about all the things that I'm into, and I think all the people that I'm friends with online, who I also thankfully know offline as well, know these things about me. So it's not so much that I can't share that with other groups of people.
Yeah, it's not quite that. What I mean by that is that because I have quite a sort of social media sort of presence, for want of a better word. Um, I don't tend to, I just say what it is I'm doing. I don't make a big thing of it. But it's actually sort of like the undercurrent of it.
Mm.
So, well, I'll give you the most recent example of this before, and then I'll stop talking about myself.
That's what I think.
Um, I've just moved, right? And I've just moved from a house that was in a place in Sussex, which was more or less on the edge of the village that I was in,
Mm.
right? Um, and I've now moved to another place, which is on the edge of the village. Um, it's it also facilitates the fact that because I do a lot of walking, I've always done a lot of walking, that I can actually walk to and fro. It's close to the countryside because I don't like living in towns, never have done. Um, I've always been interested in the countryside, and that's where I am. It's like, well, okay, so where I'm living is a perfect representation of what it is that I've been saying about myself. And it's not like I've looked for that. It's that it presents itself in that way.
Just an unconscious manifestation.
It's weird. It's totally weird. Um, yeah. Anyway, that's just an example. But it
No,
sort of
no,
happens,
I think I understand what
and
you're
it's like,
talking
oh
about.
God, it's happened again. That's how it strikes me. It's like, oh yeah, well, there it goes. It's just the same thing it's always been. So let's go back to your thing about what you've been doing. Okay, so you mentioned magical practice and stuff like that. So
Well, I mean, the book it isn't necessarily about why it's an interest of mine rather than because I think we have a fairly similar interest in terms of magical, like practical magical applications. But the book itself comes out of it's weird because it kind of charts my introduction to magic a little bit as well. So I first we could do the whole background story. So
yeah,
I've always been a big history nerd. Like growing up as a kid, I was always fascinated by the past. I grew up in Coventry, which is a city that was pretty much destroyed during the Second World War. In fact, it was Coventrated. It was a word that was used to
yeah,
describe utterly destroyed. Um, and growing up we had remnants of the medieval city, and I was always fascinated by that. I was a very romantic kid in that sense, and I think I wasn't. It wasn't until I was about 17 or 18, like doing A-level history. In fact, when I went to university a bit later on, that I didn't realise what history was. I was essentially just looking into history as things that happened in the past. I wasn't actually looking at history as to why things happened. And it was yeah, quite a stark learning curve to find that out so late on, after being interested in history for such a long period of time. So my interest in witchcraft and magic came from a visit to the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle in the late 90s. I went not expecting much. I thought it was going to be a little bit hokey. It was quite a pretentious kid, and went in and utterly changed. It was an absolutely fascinating and mind-blowing experience, and it made me appreciate a history of something that I didn't really have any interest in beforehand.
Can I
Didn't.
just jump, because if people don't know about this place, um, we just need to, because actually I don't think, I think probably some people have referred to it before, maybe, but it's only a very small
Oh,
museum,
it's tiny. Yeah.
but it's one of these places that when you walk into, it's like you've entered another place.
Yeah.
I mean, in every shape or form, a sort of a space that is unlike anything, I would say, that you're likely to experience anywhere else. Because it's just an extraordinary place, isn't it?
Absolutely incredible. It punches well above its weight in terms of
Yes,
a small museum.
yes.
Yeah.
And I think what it is because the stuff that's in it is so visibly real.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's got this sort of uh, um, what's the word I'm looking for? It's got this sort of every item in it. It seems alive.
It's a completely it's a choir. It's essentially a choir that you walk into, and I refer to it as being an axis, like a axis magica mundi.
Yeah,
It's like a point in
yeah,
which you've not just got the museum itself, but you've got the landscape of Cornwall. You've got
yes,
layers of history, of mythology,
yes.
of the it, it's the sediments that are there in terms of it of oh I'm kind of tripping over myself trying to describe it in a way that adequately describes it.
Well, it's actually, I think it's
Yeah,
actually almost impossible to
no,
do that because again, I was looking for a word that I can't find in my head. So I think you said something really important about the fact that it's sort of embedded in that place
mm,
because obviously Boscastle um, being a harbour,
mm.
uh, and there would have been fishermen going out, and that bit of coastline is bloody dangerous. I
Oh,
used to live near there. I used to live near there. I used to live. My mum lived in Delabole, which is
oh yeah, the Great Hole of Delabole.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And we lived in before that. Before that, we lived in Weybridge, but we used to go to Boscastle because it's absolutely beautiful. But of course, being a fishing uh, little fishing harbour, um, people would have gone to see people, cunning folk and witches that could have um, helped the fishermen.
Well, there's stories. I mean, Cecil Williamson said he moved there because of the stories of the witches selling the sailors the wind. They would
It's
tie up
selling the wind.
the wind in
Yeah,
the knots. I
yeah,
mean, so that's one of the stories that drew him there.
yeah, yeah. And of course, the thing is, of course, weather magic is a really important part of witchcraft because it would be.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that, isn't it? in whatever culture,
I mean, one
because
of the
the
things
weather is an
Williamson
important
worked
aspect.
No, yeah, exactly. And one of the things that Williamson worked with extensively was the winds, like and directionality. And
Yeah,
when you're there on that headland with the winds coming at you from all directions,
yeah,
um, yeah, it's an incredible landscape in which to work.
yeah. It is incredible. And so when we lived in Cornwall, I can remember stories of people being blown off the cliffs. There was a one particular in Boscastle. There was a woman who was they reckon she was about 18 stone, was blown off the cliff. And of course, you saw, because again, if you live in a place like that, the elements are like, you, you, you've got to respect
Mm.
the tides because they're not straightforward there. They're very dangerous, and the wind. Right? And Boscastle also had this incredible flood
Yeah,
a few years
2004.
ago. And that was weird because my sister still lives in Weybridge, and she was saying that it was a sunny day, and they looked up the coast, and there was this enormous black cloud, but it was just sitting
Out
over,
there.
yeah, it was sitting over Boscastle, and that was it. And of course, it it devastated the place, didn't it? There were cars being washed out into the sea and all sorts of stuff. Incredible.
Well, I
So
think Graham King, who owned who ran the museum at the time, he was the first to raise the alarm. So he was pivotal in managing to get people out because there were no deaths. It was a
yeah,
miracle nobody got
it
killed.
was amazing because it was astonishing, and it happened so fast. So yeah, very. So let's go back to the. Sorry, we interjected there, but I think it's
No,
important for people
I
to
live for
understand
interjections.
because honestly, it is one of the most amazing places that you can go to. I mean, as you say, it changed you. So how
Oh,
did it change you?
well, I'd always had like running concurrently around with the history nerding as a child. I was always very interested in the supernatural as well. Like I grew up reading books by Peter Underwood, who was a famous ghost hunter from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And every time I went on a holiday somewhere, because we always holidayed in England, we never really went abroad as kids. I would always kind of go to the secondhand stores, secondhand shops to try and find Peter Underwood books. So, um, and having that running alongside, kind of, I wasn't particularly interested in magic growing up. It was always ghosts and UFOs, but Boscastle was it was the straw that broke the camel's back in that respect. And it was like, right, okay, we're off to the races now. What's all this about?
Hmm.
I didn't really touch anything. I mean, my interest in magic didn't go at that point in time. I would have been about 15 or 16 when I went to Boscastle for the first time. I didn't really look at it properly until I was a bit older. So I was looking at that point in time, the um, it, predominant kind of witchcraft and magic in popular culture was Wicca,
Yeah,
and that never really did much for me. It was like when you go around the Museum of Witchcraft, you kind of finished on the Wicca bit at that point in time anyway, and it was kind of like it was amazing up until that point, and it was like not really into this. Like Gerald Garner and his crew really didn't do anything for me personally.
no,
And there were books. I remember getting a book called, I think it was by Ray Beth, Hedge Witch, and just reading it and
yeah, yeah,
thinking,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
this is wet. I just don't get any of it. It doesn't speak to me at all.
No,
And it wasn't until I read Triumph of the Moon just before I went to university that um, that's when I found the way into magic. It was essentially through popular academia, and I started looking at it was a bit of time passed from there, and then I think it was it, when I first started to see my partner. Um, the first holiday that we went down to Boscastle, so I got to take him to Boscastle for the first time, and then he took me to Snowshill, where he'd been as a kid, and I'd never been there before. And Boscastle has a collection of items from Snowshill Manor, which is a National Trust property in the Cotswolds. And I made the link between the two.
All right.
That's where the interest in Snowshill Manor came from. And it was around that time I started looking for contemporary magical practices, and that's also where I found Gordon White and his work. I think I was trying to find some. I was reading a lot of Julian Vane at the time. I
Yeah.
was really interested in chaos magic, and I was doing bits and pieces with that with sigils and whatnot, as everybody does when they first get
Yes.
into like, practical magic. And I found Gordon White through an interview that he did with Julian Vane, and then that set me off looking at his stuff and put me in contact with things like Jake Stratton Kent's work, with the work of Peter White, like his systemic, and yeah, and I've been kind of following that's that current ever since.
Mm. So this Snows Hill is called, is it? This, yeah. So tell me a little bit about this then, because
Yes, if nobody's visited, then I can fully heartily recommend that you take a trip to the Cotswolds at some point. It's a National Trust property that was restored by a guy called Charles Paget Wade. Wade was an architect, but his family had sugar plantations in St. Kitts. So when his father died, he was pretty much sorted for money. His mum ran the business for him, and after the First World War, he essentially just spent most of his time renovating this property in the Cotswolds. Um, he was essentially a big kid. Like he collected things. He had a passion for collecting, and he filled the property with things that he liked, primarily things that were well crafted. Like he had this maxim. He collected things that had good color, workmanship, and oh goodness, I've forgotten his maxim now, but basically with things that he liked, and there were examples of dying crafts as well. He was very
yeah, so
keen,
it's a bit arts and crafts movement
very
stuff.
arts
Yeah.
and crafts influenced,
Yeah.
yeah. Workmanship, color, and design. Workmanship, color, and
Yeah.
design.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was his maxim. One of them.
Yeah.
He himself lived in a little outbuilding. I mean, little outbuilding. It's quite a substantial cottage just outside the manor, but over the course of like 30 years, he amassed this amazing collection. But the thing that interested me is at the very top of the manor, he created a room called the Witch's Garret, and he filled this full of items that, to all intents and purposes, look as if they're related to witchcraft. Um, when he died, he wasn't there to kind of anchor the collection. And what he was doing when he was alive, he would have people round. People would come and visit the house. It was kind of a tourist attraction. He would take them around. He would give them kind of a theatrical tour, and he would hide in certain places, use secret passages, come out in different costumes. There's this
Right.
wonderful. Oh no, he was amazing. He was a
Yeah.
big kid, and there's this one example. Virginia Woolf, the writer, she visited in 1934, and she kind of writes in her diary. One of her friends writes in the diary that she went with, that so they went up to the necromancer's den, and he was there, kind of trying to like spook them and tell them stories, and she wasn't having any of it at all, and she was just kind of just pissed off that she missed a train back because none of the clocks in the manor were set to the right time. They all went off at different times, so he could enjoy the chimes. It was that kind of place. So Wade styled himself as kind of he kind of called himself the necromancer, and in his poetry he writes about a character called Sylvanus of Thuringia, and he's creating a theatrical character for himself. And the Witch's Garret is in itself a theatrical set. The paintings that you find up there, the wall paintings and the floor paintings, they're all very accurate. They all come from sources from a book written by a French guy called de Gevry, and this book is a really great pictorial reference for um, late medieval, early modern magic. Wade took images from this book and essentially mixed and matched them. It was almost cut up in that perspective,
Yes.
but created something that, to all intents and purposes, looked very, very like genuine. And he had a replica of a wondrous candle that comes from the Petit Albert. He had what looked like a hand of glory There were skulls. There were pufferfish hanging from the ceiling. There was a crocodile in there. So it's this combination of Cabinet of Curiosities stroke Witch's Den, like out
Yeah,
of a woodcut.
yeah, yeah.
And when he died, he wasn't there to kind of anchor it as a theatrical installation, and so it takes
Right.
on this ominous, almost sinister appeal. And that's where Cecil Williamson comes in, who owned the Museum of Witchcraft that was in Bolton on the Water at the time. He was invited in by the National Trust to kind of look at this room. And this is 10 years after, nearly 10 years after Wade has died. And he takes one look at the room, he makes some notes. And at some point, he writes a letter to the National Trust saying, right, these items all belong to an especially dangerous black magician. I need to take them all away from you now, burn them on a certain night on Meon Hill, which, if you know anything about the local area, Meon Hill is the site of the Charles Walton murder, the St. Valentine's Day murder.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, Snowsill, like the Museum of Witchcraft, Snowsill sits in a landscape of mythology
Yeah,
and folklore. You've got the witches of Long Compton down the road. You've
yeah,
got the Rollright Stones. You've got Meon Hill and the murder of Charles Walton. You've got Bella and the Witch Elm up near Worcester. You've got a lot of folklore going on, and odd things happening there, and all of this kind of compounds the sinister reputation of the witches Garrett. And I think this is what Williamson was leaning into when he wrote this letter. So Williamson takes a smaller, he doesn't take the whole collection, he takes certain items which look particularly magical. He displays them for a short period of time at the Museum of Witchcraft in Boscastle, in Bolton on the Water, rather. And he says that they're from Snowsill. And we know that the National Trust let him have these items. They say, we've got no problem with you borrowing these because we can see the receipts, essentially. We've got letters from the National Trust. We can see um, how this transaction went. They were originally loaned. But what I think what happened was Williamson wrote this letter saying, no, actually, they're all very dangerous. I need to burn them. Then moves to Boscastle in 1965. He's already bought Boscastle in the early 60s, but he moves out of Born on the Water in 65 and takes the collection with him. And the interesting thing at this point is that at that point in time, all references to Snowsill disappear from the collection. He gives them all new narratives,
right.
and they have new stories attached to them. So for the best part of 30, 40 years, they're not known as the Snowsill collection. And that's what I'm really interested in. So that's what the book's about. It's about the journey of these items and what Cecil Williamson did with them and what he did with them and what that means for what we would call magical items or items that are used in magical practice.
Yeah,
So,
that's fascinating. I mean, that's sort of like opening a can of worms, is it not?
oh,
Because it's
good! It really is. It really, and I've really tried to have a foot in both camps because I wanted the book to be read by people who were not magically literate in that sense, but I also wanted to be true to my experience of magic as well, and within the current of Western occultism, because that's where it sits, but
mm,
also looking forward to where occultism or magic is going, and that is towards kind of the dominant of witchcraft, that towards hopefully a new animism, or heading towards that way. And so, looking at the objects as non-human persons and looking at the agency that they have. And it's quite obvious that when you start to go into the metaphysics and the nitty gritty of these objects, is that they have an agency, they have a story, they are
mm.
telling the story, and they are not finished yet. They are
No,
still fulfilling their telos, their destiny.
it's interesting you say this because I want to spin this back into music because there's something interesting about songs that do something like this, where you get certain songs that have not only a life of their own, like a life force that you can sort of go, that song does stuff in the world that really is beyond it just being a song.
Mm.
And then you have other songs that morph into other things.
Yes.
And this is always fascinating me.
It's
Um,
almost as if things have spirits. and they have it.
Yes,
Yeah, it's
yes,
incredible, isn't it?
yes, yes. So I started sort of messing around with this idea. Well, I don't know when, to be honest. Maybe I've always thought a little bit like this. But I remember talking to Stuart Wilde about this actually, because I had a strange experience. Now, where I don't know where it was, but I said to Stuart, I have this thing about this sort of like the angel of song,
Mm.
and it's strange because Leonard Cohen said has that as a lyric in a one of his later pieces. Um, but it was sort of a strange. I think it must have been a dream or something like that. And Stuart was really sort of quite struck by this thing. He said, "That's um, amazing," and it was funny because obviously it was his way of how he responded to it that really had an effect on me. It was just really just sort of chatting to him about stuff. And the more I thought about it, because it's like the muses, right? It's this sort of
Yes.
idea that there's something extra to our ourselves that gives us the inspiration or passes the inspiration through. And the more I've sort of pondered this, the more I start to notice things that are sort of rather odd. But if you allow that to be a an understanding of what a piece of music is, it becomes even more powerful and it arrives quicker
Mm.
than if you think that you are writing it. Now that you could say, well, psychologically that's very powerful because you just don't get in the way,
Mm.
right? You allow the ideas to flow.
Well, it
But
becomes a conversation.
yes, well, in fact, it starts to talk to you. It's almost like you don't really have to say very much because it's talking to you.
It's funny you should use that turn of phrase as well, because there's something that Cecil Williamson called the language of silence, which is how he would communicate with things around his house. Because he was
Oh, well, that's
he was
interesting.
an animist, like, and he would speak to objects, but he would communicate in his kind of meditative, quiet
Yes,
style. Or that's how it seems. I mean, he never actually wrote very much about his own personal practice.
yeah,
He described it by statements such as the language of silence, but he didn't describe exactly what that is. But
right.
from
Well,
gather,
that's
it
that's
was very, very similar.
well, that's interesting because really the way that you you communicate with a song is you listen
Hmm.
and and it appears in your head. The next bit appears in your head, right? And but anyway, this thing about these songs when they morph, you get some songs that have such a long life, right? They're hundreds of years old, and they might have started off as something else,
Hmm.
right? And then they sort of re-emerge. I mean, the classic one, and I've mentioned this before, is Jingle Bells.
Hmm. I don't think I've
Uh,
heard you mention this before.
yeah, but there's another twist to this actually, what I discovered recently was that Jingle Bells wasn't written as a Christmas carol. It was written as a song about a sleigh ride. They had nothing to do with Christmas.
Hmm.
In fact, if you look at the lyrics, it doesn't mention Christmas, just mentions the snow and all the rest of it. And it was called In a One Horse Open Sleigh. That was the original title. But it was written by uh, what was the American financier? J.P. Morgan. It was written by a relative of J.P. Morgan. I
Wow.
didn't realize this until very recently. So I don't know if it was a cousin or something like that. So you sort of go, well, that is totally bizarre. Because if anybody would have earned a lot of money out of the royalties of a song,
Yeah, I can imagine that they would have found some way of marketing
well,
that.
it's incredible. It's almost like they've got the Midas touch.
And also, you can argue if it would have been as successful if it had been written by somebody who wasn't the cousin of a massive financier. So, yeah,
But yeah, so there are a lot of songs like that their life goes on beyond what you would expect because they almost starts to manipulate people's awareness of it. I will
Well,
put it like that.
that's a really good segue for describing one of the objects in the Snowshill collection. Because so what happens when so they're in Boscastle. Cecil Williamson has given them completely different histories and narratives. So what was the wondrous candle, which is kind of based on a description of the Petty Bear, but comes from a woodcut print that is found in the De Gevry book. That becomes so it goes from being a treasure hunting spell essentially to a spirit trap, and he describes it as something you would place between a grave and a tree, or in the gap of a grave, in order to lure moths, which are the spirits of the deceased.
Right.
So that design ends up being copied less than 4 or 5 years from it being in Boscastle and ending up in a graveyard in Cambridge and being written about by Nigel Pennick in his book East Anglian Magic.
Right.
You've got something that initially started out as a theatrical prop,
Yeah.
being given a new narrative, being told, people read the caption and they see, right, it's in a museum. So therefore, there's some kind of legitimacy to this thing behind glass. I'm reading this information. It's in a museum. It must be legit. That then ends up that design, that description ends up being copied nearly word for word. So Nigel Pennick, he interprets the seal. It's like a brass and copper seal that's behind it. He interprets the seal on it as being runic in origin, but it's not. We don't actually know where the origin of that particular seal is. I think it comes from a version of one of the geomantic figures. But Nigel Pennick, he says it's runic in this context of it working in Cambridge. So yeah, you've got the theatrical prop becomes magical object, becomes a fake magical object, becomes a real magical object. So what does that mean for the object in the middle? It's kind of quasi magical. It's a catalyst as such. Um, I I don't know if I could put my finger on and say the Snowshill objects are magical objects. I believe they fill a gap in between, which kind of makes them arguably even more potent. So, and I feel that that's kind of very similar to the morphing songs that you're talking about. This ability for things to change and to um, alter. It's like the prism splitting the light in that
Yes.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. I there's a lad that I teach. He's a very, very good classical guitar player, but he's into doing drum and bass, right?
Okay.
And so he records stuff and whatever. He records tracks and things. So I try to tie in like music theory into the drum and bass thing because he's sat and played these classical guitar pieces and all the rest of it. And he has quite a long lesson with me every week. And then we sort of like move it sideways into something contemporary. And I played him some stuff by Moby. And because a lot of his tracks are old blues,
Mm.
gospel stuff that have been taken and reworked and all the rest of it. And strangely, I've been teaching a few other people different songs, in different contexts. And several of them had been old blues numbers that had been you wouldn't have known the original blues number. You would have known Black Betty
Yeah.
by the Ram Jam band, but of course it was a lead belly song, right? And of course the thing is he's not even playing guitar; he's just clapping and singing on the original. So it was interesting that there are a number of songs that had, like you're saying, changed. They'd morphed into something else and become incredibly successful in the world, and people didn't even realize what they were originally, which takes it back to the thing you were saying about these items. People actually didn't know what they were.
Mm.
So only what they knew was what they'd become.
Mm. But that's not
That,
what that's not their end product though. They're still
no,
they are becoming, you know.
yeah, they are becoming. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. But and I think that's an interesting point when you get that phenomena.
And like the songs that you're talking about, they'll be covered countless times. You know that they will still keep going on and on and on because they're on a mission. You know,
Yes.
I don't even know what their mission. We can never know. Well, we might be able to find out what their mission is, but um, they will keep developing
Yeah.
and because maybe it's to remain relevant, to keep inspiring.
Well, they just keep growing.
Yeah.
Um, and there's something interesting with regard to that, because I think some of these things, the essence of a lot of things, are a little bit like trees, actually. I mean, I've been quite fascinated by how the yew tree is such a synonymous thing to do with the afterlife and death and all the rest of it, right? And it's one of the most poisonous trees that we've got. I mean, there's only one little bit of it that's not deadly poisonous. And you couldn't really successfully eat that without avoiding poisoning yourself on a bit that's inside
I've been tempted, but I don't want to risk it for such a
no,
small.
no, the little red berry. And weirdly, normally you'd think, oh, red, keep out of the way of that. But it's the only thing that's okay. But the pip inside is not.
Mm.
It's like, but the interesting thing about the yew tree is, of course, it regenerates itself. It sort of grows inside itself. So that's a bizarre thing. And what's interesting about these things is they're a bit like that. These ideas, these songs, they're like elements that regrow inside the thing. It's very odd. And, okay, we find patterns, don't we? That's what we're good doing as humans.
Almost like Mandelbrot. It's like the Mandelbrot. Oh, what's it called? Mandelbrot sequence. I mean, I don't know enough about it, but you describing it there kind of sounds a bit like the visual representations of that you said.
Yeah, sort of fractal stuff. Yeah.
Yes, that's the best way of saying it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, sometimes when we sort of step back from things and we start looking at, again, we're back to that sort of the edges of things again, right?
Yeah. It's the best place to be. It's the eco
Well,
zone.
absolutely is the best place to be, isn't it? So when you sort of look at the edges of stuff like that and you go, what? Well, that's strange. The answer for what we want here is sort of sitting out there somewhere, right? The answer to that thing might be the life cycle of I don't know, a beach or something. and and there's something fascinating about taking that back into the sort of the realms of witchcraft, is the way that people instinctively knew things about the landscape and things that you would take from the landscape. Well, not take from the landscape, that's not the right word. That you would use that's within the landscape. So it could be being in a particular place, or it could be something from a tree from that particular place, or whatever. People just knew they had a relationship with things, which takes us back again to what you were saying about Boscastle and about Snowshill, because where they're situated.
Mm.
Which is interesting because we've got this is a little bit of our disconnect that we have, where we want the answer for something, and it just happens to be in some culture that's not necessarily anything. You know what I mean? So there's something in that, in the essence of a way of thinking, I think is really important.
Yeah, I mean, the good example would be the language of silence I was talking about that Williamson used. I draw a comparison to it to Didiri, deep listening. which is an Australasian Aboriginal Australasian term. It's not the same thing, but it's a bit like it. It's the
It
view,
vibes with it, yeah.
yeah. And like you say, we're so as a Western culture, we say we have that disconnect. We haven't lived on within a landscape in relationality, in right relationality for very many generations now. That's where that disconnect comes from. And people knew how to do things because they were living it. They had they had knowledge that was passed on generationally that was I don't think it was particularly magical in any sense. It was just practical knowledge that they were able to read things because they were embedded in that particular environment.
Hmm.
Um, we have not had that for at least 200-300 years now. The Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, because I think one of the most important
Yeah,
things here is a lot of people used to spend a lot of time in very quiet places.
yeah.
Right?
And where are they now?
Well, there aren't any. Well, very few. There might be more at your neck of the woods, but certainly not down here.
It depends what
You
time of
can't get
year,
an
I
awful lot of
suppose. Yeah,
silence there. But because there's a biblical reference here, which I think is quite interesting. You know, when you get the sort of nativity story, and the angels, turn up, right? Ta-da! Right? Who do they go and see?
oh, it's the dudes.
They go and see the shepherds, right? The shepherds are the ones who are minding their own business, sitting very quietly up in the hills. There's something in that. There's something in the fact that they go and see them. It's because probably these are the dudes, as you say, that are sitting around thinking, "Well, there's something really strange going on tonight." Right? I mean, in that story, they didn't go and see the posh merchants and all that sort of stuff. You know what I mean? It's they were really on. It's really on point that they would, it would be the people who'd spent a lot of time alone, right? Okay, with a lot of sheep and making sure there are no wolves, right? So you had to be absolutely aware, otherwise you're going to have your sheep eaten on by whatever is out there. So I think you're absolutely right. That would not have been looked upon as being a magical practice. It would have been normal. And I think a lot of this stuff is totally normal. It's just
Yeah,
that we have to sort of bracket it in a particular way. I mean, it is magical, but it's like a lot of things. It's like health, isn't it? The most effective practices that you can do health-wise seem not to be healthy. You see what I mean?
it's common sense, isn't it? And you
Yeah,
can't tell common sense.
yeah. Some of it is sort of almost counterintuitive. Um, but and I think we've lost that because we have this sort of thing that we want everything to make sense
Mm.
instead of it being common sense, which often doesn't make sense on the face of it until you sit back and look at it and suddenly go, "Oh yeah, hang on, yeah, yeah." It's like an old wives' tale type of thing. When you look at it, it goes, "Oh yes, that does absolutely make sense." It's just us being stupid that we sort of go like, "Oh, you know." But yeah,
I think
so
well, it kind of
so
speaks. Oh, sorry.
this book, yeah, I was just thinking about the time
Oh,
when.
sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking because we could go on ages with this, so we might. The book. Tell me more about when is this? Where is it available? And
So it's not available yet. So I suppose we could get together just before it comes out at some point. But
yeah, that'd be great.
it's in the position now. It's weird. So it's going to be if all goes well, it's going to be published by Troy Books, who are
Oh,
based in
fabulous.
Cornwall. So and they've produced some lovely books in the
Yes, they
past.
do. Yeah.
So their speciality is traditional witchcraft practices, but they also have books that specialize on the Museum of Witchcraft. You've got Steve Patterson's book on Cecil Williamson. So if anybody's
Yeah.
interested in Cecil Williamson, his biography on so Steve Patterson's biography on what Cecil Williamson is, was absolutely invaluable. I fully recommend that to anybody who's interested in that. And they also have Phil Martell's book on the Rochelle collection. which is another part of the Museum of Workshop, which is equally as fascinating. Amazing book. But so it feels right being with them. It feels
Yeah.
within that stable, for the Museum
Yeah.
of Witchcraft. But I'm hoping. I don't think it's going to be this year now, because I've recently had a couple of new things come through, and they're more they're more nice to know things. But I need to chase up a few things on those, and they're bits of information I thought I would never get. Um, so one of them involves a ghost hunting tour that took place in Snowshill in the 1960s, and we've got some photos from that particular trip
Wow.
that I'd heard about, but I never thought I'd see. So that's quite interesting. So I'm going to try and work a little bit in with those, and I think it would be better next year because it'll be the 60th anniversary of the objects leaving Snowsill next year as well.
Right.
So I think
Oh,
it might
that does make sense.
that might be a little bit better. And goodness, I've been working on this for over 10 years now, so it makes no sense to rush it at the moment.
No.
Yeah,
Well, books take a long time to write.
yeah. But I've been extremely lucky. I mean, it's more than anything, it's been an excuse to talk to a lot of people I've looked up to and admired for a long time. It's been a vehicle for my own kind
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
nerding and fanboying, but also it's been a wonderful way to get to some places that I never thought I'd get to. So
Yeah.
going up to the Garret and to certain rooms in Snowsill, but yeah, it's been a really wonderful experience, and I'm very lucky that my partner, who's a writer, so he's copy edited it for me. He's done an awful lot of the hard work.
Right.
So
Because
it's yeah,
because you certainly need somebody to do that because it's hard.
don't know until that's done. You don't know. You need another pair of eyes, or at least two pairs of
Absolutely.
eyes on.
Oh my God. Absolutely. Yeah. But you're doing a talk, aren't you, in Welshpool, aren't you?
Yes, so I was invited to the Welsh Occult Conference in Welshpool. So that's in May. I think it's May the 18th, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm doing a talk on the objects themselves.
Yeah.
I've done a couple of talks about the subjects of Snowsill and Charles Paget Wade and Cecil Williamson, but this is going to be all about the magical utility of these objects and the journey they've been on. Because I
Right.
thought being a magical conference, it's going to be more practical. It's going to be
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
in tune with that particular subject. So
Yeah. Good stuff.
get to nerd out about it with
Yeah.
people.
Excellent stuff. Hopefully, I'll see you then.
Yeah, it'd be great to catch up.
Yeah.
It's all chatting, and look forward to a couple of drinks with you on that day. It should
Yeah.
be good. I'll have to apologise. We've actually got one of our nights the night before, so I'm going to be incredibly hungover and groggy. So I don't know how it's going to go.
Oh well.
So,
It's all
but
part.
you've got the goth
As
night
you
in
said,
Chester
grist
the night
for the
before.
mill.
Yeah, I'll
All
be in
right
an
then, Mark.
altered state.
That's brilliant, mate. All right.
No worries, mate.
So I'll speak to you soon. Don't disappear. But I'll say goodbye now. All right. See you
Take
then.
care, mate. All the best.